Okay, last video of the semester on Billy Collins, and this one should be a little shorter and a little more cheerful because he is not your typical postmodern poet. He has a lighter view of things, so I really like to wrap up this semester um, with just a little more, something a little more pleasant than some of the darker poetry we've been reading. So let me just throw all his bio up here. Because he is still living, we don't know a whole lot of details about his life. Um, we know he was an only child. He was influenced by his mother's love of poetry. He spent most of his life as an English professor, so he both, taught writing and taught literature and was a poet himself. So nothing really extraordinary has come out of his biography yet. Of course, that you never know. That always changes sometimes as we gain some distance. He was the Poet Laureate of the United States from 2001 to 2003. And if you don't know what that means, the Poet Laureate is essentially you are like a federally paid employee. And so it was his job to be the official poet of the United States. And you might ask yourself, what does that person do? Well, for example, for different occasions, they may be asked to write a poem. Billy Collins wrote a very famous poem called The Names after 9/11 as he was issued to do by President Bush. So, that's kind of a neat thing. I don't even know who our current poet laureate is, but, it changes from year to year. So go ahead and open up your textbook if you haven't already to page 823. And the first poem we're going to look at is called Forgetfulness. And I almost forgot I had this picture in my slideshow. So here is me and Dr. Thompson and Miss Erin, and we got to meet Billy Collins. We went to a reading a few years ago, and so that was a really special moment for us. We were fangirling pretty intensely there as we got to meet him. So I thought I'd share that picture. Anyway, forgetfulness. Okay, so this is a poem about forgetfulness, which may resonate with you as college students because you have a lot of information in your minds that you often forget. So, the first thing I want us to look at is the overall tone of the poem. So, let's read a little bit. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. As if one by one the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. So here the tone is very lighthearted. And again, I choose this poem because I feel like college students can identify with this. You spend all this time consuming information, reading a novel, and it's as if piece by piece that information just trickles out of your brain and you forget it. So there's kind of a lighthearted, humorous tone here. And then he has this, the most of the poem is just kind of this long list of things that you forget and what it's like to forget them. And the tone does change a little bit at the end. So let's see, the last couple stanzas. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall, well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have even forgotten how to swim or how to ride a bicycle, which are supposed to be skills you never forget. So it takes a little bit of a turn here. And the last stanza, no wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. So it becomes a little more melancholy and kind of that sense of longing of, you know, what was that poem that this scene makes me think of? And to the point that you would actually like get out of bed to look something up because it's starting to bother you that you can't remember it. So it is interesting that we see the tone of the poem go from light and humorous to a little more melancholy, a little more thoughtful. I did want to point out the effect of the personification um, is really neat. He gives the memories person, right? They retire to a fishing village. If you look at, let's see, line, right around line 15, Whatever you're struggling to remember is not poised on the tip of your tongue. It is not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. So, giving these memories action, giving them some personality lurking. So that, again, kind of adds to the lighthearted tone of the poem. And then at the end of the day, in some ways, this poem is a commentary on the process of aging. What it is like to have a full life full of details. And then as you get older, those things tend to slip away piece by piece, and it becomes harder to remember them. So, just a neat little poem, very lighthearted. I love his tone. I love how, just the way that he communicates experience is so relatable. So that's a great thing about Billy Collins. So again, not like a deep, intense analysis here, just more of looking at the basic idea of this poem. Now, the other poem you read was called Litany, and this might be a little harder to understand if you don't have context. So let me give you a little context here. This poem is satire, and you can see on page 829, underneath the title of the poem, he quotes another poet, which the two lines that he quotes are the same two lines he uses in his poem. And so essentially, he, was reading this poem one day and he thought, wow, that's really dumb. And he decided to take this idea to its extreme and create a very long list of ridiculous metaphors. And so that's what makes it satire, it's corrective ridicule. And for this one, I did want to let you see Billy Collins reading his own work. So we'll listen to him read Litany here.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help.
After the
This sentence is grammatically correct.
Skip. Here we go.
For a TV, the world is thinking.
Here's a poem that I like to read, which is kind of another, it just connects with that one because it's also stealing something from another poet. And a lot of this stuff goes on rather covertly that I'm not going to tell you about, but some of it, there are different kinds of thefts, and some of them are daylight crimes, just knocking over a jewelry store at noon. But another stuff is like a second story guys. But this is very open. I take the first two lines of someone else's poem and rewrite it for them, which is this is done out of courtesy to when you see a poem that doesn't seem to get that seems to fail, you can just rewrite it and improve upon it that way. So this is I came across this love poem in a magazine, and it's a series of comparisons in which the poet relies on a very ancient device in Western love poetry, at least dating back to the Middle Ages, which is to compare the beloved to various things in the world, and therefore, by flattering her, so your eyes are like stars and whatnot, you make headway. And so his poem really is a wheel spinning exercise in these kinds of comparisons. About 40 lines of just the same stuff. You're like, this, you are this and that. So he begins by saying to the beloved, he says, "You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine." Litany. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh birds suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter, or the house of cards. And you are certainly not the pine-scented air. There is no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head, but you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show that you are neither the boots in the corner nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof. I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I am not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, not to mention the crystal goblet and somehow the wine.
Okay, so again, I hope you guys see the humor in that. It really is a funny poem because it's mockery. He's mocking this person. Um, so if we look at the first two lines of the poem, "You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine," we have to ask ourselves, is this an effective metaphor? Why or why not? So you think about if you're comparing someone to a loaf of bread and the knife, like what does that mean? You cut yourself into slices? What? You are the goblet and the wine? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In order for a metaphor to work, there has to be some parallel, some similarities between the two things. Like if you say your eyes are twinkling stars, well, then that makes sense. The eyes are beautiful, they're glowing, they're glimmering, they bring joy, right? These lines don't make any sense whatsoever as metaphor. So, and that's essentially what's happening here is he latched onto that and said, what other ridiculous metaphors can I come up? And essentially, what he's done is he's used humor to create effective satire. All these other metaphors. It is possible you are the fish under the bridge, or maybe even the pigeon on the general's head. That doesn't sound like a flattering metaphor, even though no one's really sure what it means. So anyway, that's all this poem is. It's satire, it's humor. And what's great about this, here we see a little bit of metafiction, as we talked about with postmodernism. He is using poetry to poke fun at poetry. And I think it takes, a great deal of humility and skill to do that, to write an effective poem that is making fun of a type of poetry that can bring us humor and laughter. So again, that idea of metafiction, poetry about poetry, writing about writing. So that's really all I have to say about Billy Collins. He's a great poet. He's got a lot of stuff that is just contemplative and thoughtful and humorous. So I hope you enjoyed just this little sampling. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.